How's it going out there, YouTube? My name is Jesse and I'm back for another comic book video. Now we are continuing with Riding the Range Month, Longhorns. Now, I found this character as an interesting one to review. This comes out of Fawcett Comics, and this is before Fawcett Comic Books would sell off, before they would close down and sell off some of their assets to other comics. This one was not only done by Fawcett Comics, a number of other publications did some comic books before and at the same time that Fawcett was coming out with some of theirs. Now, this is it was a comic book of a real person in a fictional role. We are going to go over Tom Minks. Now, Tom Minks was an actor who did primarily Western movies. In fact, he helped to define the Western genre back in the early days of the cinemas. Basically, where Westerns are now wouldn't have been there if not for Tom Minks. He had over 291 movies, and all but 9 of them were silent movies. And there have been a lot of things that's come down about him, but in the comic books they always portrayed him as a cowboy. So we're going to go over some of the publications that produced him, when they did it, and we will go over, I was able to look at some of the Fawcett comics. I found some of them on a digital museum, so I gave them a look over. I'm not going to go over all of the storylines. There are a lot of them. So I'll go over what the basic premise was from the comics and some of the other stuff that was included, which was not just Tom Minks stories. There was some other stuff mixed in there, like funnies and little other stories. So let's dive into the character of Tom Minks, and we'll go over a little bit of what was in the Fawcett comics. Let's get to it. Tom Minks. Born January 6, 1880, died October 12 in 1940. He was 60 years old. His life was cut unexpectedly short by a car accident. Now, Tom Minks did his acting in the Western movies from 1909 to 1935, where he made the 291 films that I mentioned in the intro. Now, in 1933, they started doing radio. There was a radio show of Tom Minks. It was called Tom Minks Raston Straight Shooters, and the reason it was called that, it was published by the Raston Purina. Now, I know that we know Purina as pet food, but I think back then they did cereal. Now, the radio show was actually pretty popular, which started in 1933 and ran into the early 50s, and it was fairly popular during World War II as well, except for 1 year. Now, Minks never did appear on the radio broadcast. His throat was damaged by a bullet, and his nose had been broken a number of times, so they deemed him not fit for the radio. A number of other actors would do the voice of him over the years. Now, Tom Minks' first company that featured him in a comic book would be Dell Comics from 1937 to 1938, and they did that for 11 issues. Now, the Raston Purina Company, who was the sponsors of his radio show, started offering some comic books as well after the Dell Comics. They had 9 issues of a comic book from 1940 to 1941. And there was also a 3-issue series of Tom Minks Commandos comics, but I don't believe that was anything about his westerns. Now, to get these comic books, you mailed in 2 box tops, and then they would mail you the comic books. Now, in 1948, 2 companies started producing Tom Minks Western comics at the time. There would be Fawcett Comic Books, who published 61 issues through 1948 to 1953, some of which I've been able to look at, so I'll go over some of what I noticed in those. And also, there was a company called L. Miller and Sons, which also produced Tom Minks Western comics. Now that ran from 1948 to 1951 with 85 issues. So L. Miller and Sons did do 2 years less than Fawcett, but Fawcett did it longer, but L. Miller produced more issues. Now, the reason Fawcett was able to go to 1953 is they did produce Tom Minks Western comics on a monthly basis, but near the end of its run, it went to bi-monthly. So that's why it lasted longer. Now, before I get to the Tom Minks comics, I wasn't able to read any of these, but Tom Minks would also appear in Real Western Heroes, which by issue number 76, it would be shortened to Western Heroes. Now, this comic produced, well, I'm not sure how many they produced overall. What I do know is that Tom Minks started appearing in issue 70 of Western Heroes and would keep going until issue 111. And while he was appearing in Real Western Heroes, while he was appearing also in Tom Minks Western, he would be the cover feature in 10 different issues. Now, I can't speak for the other comic books, Dell, Purina, and L. Miller, because I did not find any of those, but I did find ones from Fawcett. Now, in the beginning issues, he wore an outfit that was a combination of yellow and red. It looked a little flamboyant. But in the later issues, he wore a red shirt and blue jeans. Now, he was always riding his horse, Tony, in all the issues, and he didn't like to kill people. The issues I've seen, he didn't kill anybody. He did use his guns a lot. He was a crack shot, and he was able to disarm people a number of times. He also, well, it's like in one issue, he did shoot somebody in the shoulder to stop him from running away. So he captured his criminals. He was a crack shot and a professional writer, and he didn't always get the drop on the criminals. A number of times the criminals got the drop on him, but he was always able to defeat them in the end. And when it came to women, he was also a proper gentleman. And the reason I mention that is in one of the issues I found, he was taking on a female gang. When he went to their hideout, all the women came out to try and beat him up at once. And he said, "It's a gang of women. I will not shoot them, nor will I strike them." Now, they did capture him, and he did escape, and he ended up capturing them in a tent. And that's how that one turned out to be. Now, in the first issue of the Tom Minks Western that I was able to find, he went to this town and was showing off all of his skills of being a cowboy. His crack shooting, his roping of a steer, his ability to break a horse that nobody had been able to break before. That's taking a wild horse and making him docile and able to get a saddle and people to ride him. Apparently he was getting awarded a diamond belt, but a gang of crooks that were there to see the performance decided that they wanted the belt. So they got the drop on Tom and took off with the belt. He would later get the drop on them and tie them up and get the belt back and then deliver them to the police. And that seemed to be the premise for a lot of the comic books. Sometimes he would get knocked out or hit or beat up at first, and he would usually come back to win the day, or he didn't even need to resort to winning the day or getting beaten up first. Sometimes he would get ahead of what was coming to him. Now, there were a number of features that appeared in the Tom Mix Westerns, along with his stories. Something called Saddlehead and Cowboy Cal. Now, at first they were short strips like the size that you would see in the newspaper, and then they became one full page. They were supposed to be funnies. I didn't always get the joke, but these things came out in the 1940s and early 50s, so I don't think there's so much the jokes that were over my head. It's just that I don't know as much of the time to be able to say, oh, that's why it's funny. I mean, a couple of them I was just like, oh, I could see why it would be funny. And some of the other ones I'm just sitting here going, I don't get it. Now, apart from that, there are also a couple of other features. Now, in a lot of the early issues and into most of the later features, he had something called Tumbleweed Jr. And Tumbleweed was a little Indian boy, and they actually looked like they did that rather tactfully. And they had about 5 or 6 pages of him and his adventures, which didn't have anything to do with Tom Mix, but it was Western related. Now, in the later issues of the comic books, Tumbleweed Jr. would be taken out. I haven't actually found any reason for why, but this was just something I was looking at while I was shifting through the issues. He would have Jeter and his talking horse, Yatata. And it was kind of a jokey thing. His horse talked. That's about the best I can say of it. I guess it was just to be inside of the stories. Also, in some of the later stories, they had adventures that were totally text. There was nothing there. I mean, there was the comic books, but there was a couple of pages in there that were also text comics or text features where you'd have to read the story. That usually was a couple of pages. Now, in the early pages of the comics, where they would run 36 to 52, there was some bonus stuff inside of each of the issues. Roundup Time with Tom Mix, which they would do some Indian lore, cowboy lore, tricks and games, stuff that just stuff to be made aware of the Western. A list of radio stations that were airing the radio broadcast, and a lot of other stuff mixed in there. It's basically what you would find in a comic book nowadays, trying to sell stuff. Most of the cover issues, they looked real, and they might have taken some real photos and painted over it because they looked realistic, but they're showing one of the Tom Mix Western comics, the artwork by Norman Saunders. So, I mean, they look real, but I guess somebody drew those. Looks pretty good though. Okay, should have done this research earlier. In Dell Comic Books, Tom Minks not only appeared in the Western, not only had his own feature in the Tom Minks comics, the Western themes, he also appeared in Cracker Jack Funnies, along with some of the other properties that Dell Comics owned, such as Dick Tracy and Red Ryder, to name a few. The comics that were produced by the radio company were pretty much your standard Westerns. Tom Minks helping out people and taking out criminals, pretty much in the same way that he was in the Fawcett comics. Now, what I found out is that he not only appeared in the Tom Minks Westerns and in the real Western heroes, he started appearing in Masters comics near the tail end of the series. He would take over for Hopalong Cassidy, and starting in issue number 95, a lot of the comics, he was popular enough that, see, Captain Marvel Jr. was on every cover issue of the Masters comics from early on back. But Tom Minks would get a featured billing in those covers with a circle of his face, so you know that there were Tom Minks stories in the comic. And for a couple of issues, Tom Minks even shared the cover with Captain Marvel Jr. So in the Master Comics from 95 all the way to the end, there was Captain Marvel Jr., Tom Minks, and Naoka, who was a jungle girl. So they would rule the pages of Master Comics right up in there until the end. And this shows you how popular that he really was, that he could be featured in so many different comic books that didn't even have his name and still be in them. Now, before Fawcett went out of business, they produced a comic called Six Guns Heroes. Now, in 23 of those issues, Tom Minks was never featured in those, and this was the time that Fawcett went out of business. Charleston would take over those comics, I believe, in the late 50s, and they would do their own issue of Six Guns Heroes, and they would reprint the stories that Fawcett never used, including Tom Minks stories. So in Charleston's Six Guns Heroes, Tom Minks did appear in some of those stories. So this shows you how popular, just how popular as a comic book character he was. I mean, movies, radio, and comic books. I don't know if he's as popular today as he was back then, but he really did have his place. Well, I hope you liked this video. I hope that you appreciate the fact that I went over a real person, even though most of the stories that came out of him were, after his demise. So I think it's actually a real testament to the character that even after he passed away, there were so many stories that were still printed out about him. So, like I said, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you liked the real person thing. There's still time in the month of July to do more Cowboys. And until next one, I'll be seeing you.